I remember when I first learned what shutter angle was. It was back in the old days of the DVX 100. And I didn't even understand at that time how it worked or what it actually was. I just knew that if you wanted to shoot something like a movie, like a film, you use shutter angle and you set it to 180 degrees. A little bit later in film school, I started to understand why that was and how film cameras were built back in the day and how the shutter was a spinning wheel where half of the wheel was exposed and half wasn't for every single frame. And once I started to see that full 360-degree image circle and half being open and half being closed, realizing 180 degrees is half of a 360, it clicked a little bit more, a little bit stronger for me. I said, okay, I get shutter angle. I understand. And at that time, I didn't even really think of the benefits of switching frame rates and not having to worry about my shutter. I just knew that 180 degrees is what you set it at, and that would look like a movie, and that was great, and that was good. And yeah, it's how the film cameras were built back in the day. It wasn't until the DSLR revolution took over where everyone was telling each other online and forums on YouTube of what you need to set your shutter speed to. And you had to do this math of 1 over 2 times your frame rate. This was back in like 2008, probably. And doing that calculation and realizing that at that time, that math was based off of the 180-degree shutter angle principle or rule. There's a lot of 180-degree rules in filmmaking. You have the 180-degree line that you shouldn't pass. And so it can get a little confusing when you're talking about the 180-degree rule. So I like to stay very specific when I'm talking about shutter angle and what I mean by that. But everyone kind of picked up this 1 over 2 times your frame rate. That's what you set your shutter speed to, because every single one of these hybrid DSLR type cameras that shot video and photo was built first and foremost as a photo camera. Again, back in 2007, 2008, 2009, around that time. And so we learned to live with it. And we all set our shutter speeds accordingly, and time ticked on. And over time, I found it quickly in the Lumix cameras that, hey, I don't even remember if it was on the GH2 or the GH4. One of the Lumix cameras let you set shutter angle. And I thought, oh, great, I can go back to the old way of doing it where I don't have to do this mental math. And when I'm switching between 60 frames and 24 frames, changing my shutter speed, I don't have to worry about that. I'll just use shutter angle and I'll go from there. But unfortunately, the Lumix cameras were not the most popular. They certainly were popular with your video enthusiasts, but across the board, Canon was still very, very popular. Sony made a lot of ground. Nikon has always been there kind of with their ups and downs. But so many people kept learning shutter speed, setting their shutter speed using the photography measurements, and then having to adapt and change, depending on what frame rate they're shooting. And that's a nightmare on set, especially when you're working with other people and a whole crew of shooters, making sure that everyone is changing their shutter speed every single time you change your frame rate, because that does happen frequently. Hey, we're going to shoot this scene at 24. Hey, okay, now we're going to go shoot some B-roll at 60 frames a second. Hey, we're going to go do some super slow motion stuff at 120 frames a second. All right, guys, we're going back to 24. Hey, we're actually going to shoot this one at 30 because it's for TikTok or whatever. There's so many times you're changing your frame rate, and every single time you change your frame rate, you need to change your shutter speed to adapt to it. And this has become so common. It's like plaguing, I think, people's productions and workflows, because still to this day, shutter angle is this elusive, impossible feature that none of these camera companies seem interested in adding. Yet on the Lumix cameras, we've had it forever. And I'm kind of wondering, is there some kind of conspiracy afoot? Is this intentionally limiting these photography cameras from truly embracing their full potential? Or is it even deeper than that? Have they just forgotten how to do it? Does no one know how to program into the code, into the software of these cameras, shutter angle? Is it just an impossible feature we're never going to get? Well, I think that's a little silly, because obviously Sony has done it with the FX3 and now the FX30. The cinema line of Sony cameras, the more expensive versions, gets these relatively simple features that we've had in Lumix for over a decade now, seemingly. I don't know the exact math. I should probably calculate that at some point. But shutter angle should be obvious. It should be easy. It should be like just the standard when you're shooting video. Shutter speed is great for photography when you want to dial in your motion blur. But for video, you almost always want a consistent motion blur regardless of your frame rate. And so not having shutter angle in 2024, 2025 on every single camera, it would be like if we were still shooting 1080p with some of these cameras where, everyone's got 4K now, everyone's got 10-bit, everyone's got 422, everyone's got great autofocus in video, everyone has IBIS and pretty good stabilization across the board. And yet a silly, simple, basic little feature like shutter angle is still restricted and omitted from tons of cameras nowadays. And we're still teaching people 1/2 times your frame rate as if that's like just what you do. Like there's no other alternative. There's no better solution. You just always have to know to set your shutter speed 1/2 times your frame rate. Like we're teaching people bad habits by not having this simple feature across the board. And you're also leaving it almost easy, right, for companies like Lumix who do have shutter angle to kind of rest on that. For the longest time, Lumix didn't put phase detect in their cameras. I don't know why. I don't know if it was a budget concern, a partnership concern. Maybe they couldn't get the sensors. I don't know the behind the scenes, but everyone knew for the longest time that Lumix had terrible autofocus in video. They've fixed that since, like everything new has phase detect, but it's almost a little too late. But even without autofocus, for me and many others, shutter angle was still the killer feature. Sony could have had more market share had they just put shutter angle in their cameras. Canon could have had more market share and like eaten Lumix's lunch had they just put shutter angle in there, let alone things like open gate, which is, technically a little bit more complicated. So I get that one. You're recording more, you have to manage more data. Open gate is its own beast, but shutter angle, like that is the big thing that's holding up Lumix has built an empire, a fortune on shutter angle, from my perspective. They do have some other really good features, so don't get me wrong. That's not the only thing. But it is one of the big things that I've been harping on for over 10 years at this point, talking about shutter angle, explaining it over and over and over again. And yet to this day, Sony oh guys, shutter angle's finally here. You don't have to do that. And everyone acts like it's this brand new feature that's like, wow, can you believe they finally figured it out? It's so incredible, man. Sony, they're genius. They added a feature that we had 20 years ago, back to the beginning of my story on the DVX100. Even before then, I think there were probably other cameras that had shutter angle. So it's not new. It's not revolutionary. It should be the standard from day one. It'd be like getting a professional photography camera and you can't set your aperture. Or like you can't change your ISO. It's just always an auto. Sorry, we don't give you manual control over that. To hype 4K, 10-bit, 422, 120 frames, uncropped. You're hyping all these video features and not giving us the very basic, simple video way of setting your shutter using shutter angle. I think more people should be upset about this. I think there should be far more outrage. I don't think the Sony cameras should be nearly as popular as they are for this terrible omission they've had. But, everyone got excited about the low light capabilities. Everyone got excited about the resolution. Everyone got excited about the autofocus, not realizing how much they were sacrificing and losing by having to constantly set their shutter speed and how many mistakes have been made on countless sets across the globe from people just not setting their shutter speed properly, because it's a really easy thing to miss. When you're run and gun and you're moving quick and it's a production and we're moving on to the next thing and hey, everyone, let's switch to 60. Okay, we're shooting this next scene at 60. There's always going to be the one person who forgets to change their shutter speed when you're shooting Sony. Man, how many mistakes could have been avoided if we just had shutter angle and it was just, that's what everyone uses, that's what everyone does, and we actually teach people the proper way to shoot video. Everyone, 24, that's the film look. Well, shutter angle is the film way of setting your shutter. Like that's also the film look. Everyone's, freaking out about log profiles and dynamic range and color sampling. And no one cares about shutter angle. Oh, whatever, just set your shutter speed. Just always have this nagging thing in the back of your mind that you have to remember to do every single time you change your frame rate. Just remember, just remember, yeah, well, I'm also trying to remember, 100 other different things when you're shooting. It's so baffling to me that this is still restricted and limited to the cinema line, the FX3, the FX30. But don't worry, guys, we got it. It's finally there. Well, how about the A7S III? How about the A7 IV? How about the countless other Sony hybrid cameras that shoot video? They don't get this feature. Is it that hard to program? Is it that impossible? Have we lost the technology? We just can't do it anymore. Guys, shutter angle is impossible. No, obviously that's foolish. It's super simple. It's super easy. It should have been in these cameras 10 years ago. The moment everyone realized, the manufacturers, these companies, because they still make photography cameras, but realistically, the domination of TikTok and YouTube and content creation has gone photo has gone hand in hand with video. And I would say nowadays, video surpasses photography in terms of what people, the most people are using it. Yes, you still have your professional photographers who are just taking pictures and shooting video from time to time. But it is no surprise to me that Sony, with their heavy focus on video features, has gained an incredible amount of market share away from, the Canons of the world or the Nikons of the world. Yes, you can attribute some of that to photography, absolutely. But I think the hybrid model makes so much sense in today's world, even 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, arguably, but definitely 5 years ago. And you see that rise, and yet it's almost a slap in the face to not have shutter angle on these cameras. I can't believe it. I can't believe I'm making yet another video about shutter angle because it's still so underappreciated, so unknown by how many people out there who are shooting and just, going off shutter speed over 2 times the frame rate. Where does that rule come from? It comes from shutter angle. And you're adding steps. You're creating a problem by not just having a basic feature like shutter angle. It's incredibly frustrating and super disappointing. And yet one of the reasons why I love the Lumix cameras, because they've had it forever, as well as an army of other great video features as well.